Why would a lonely pensioner turn his yard into a glass recycling dump? Everyone in the settlement considered him a senile eccentric until a massive winter storm severed the power lines, leaving the entire district without heat or light for a long, bitter week. Autumn had been bleeding warmth from the settlement of Oak Haven for 3 straight weeks, but the deepest cold arrived not with a drop in temperature, but with the sudden, absolute silence of the valley. For Elias Thorne, the changing season was not a matter of adjusting a thermostat, it was a physical weight, an opponent he had spent decades learning to respect. Since his wife died the previous spring, the old man had taken on a daily routine that the rest of the town considered profoundly disturbing. While the younger families of Oak Haven spent their weekends winterizing their sprawling vinyl-clad homes with synthetic spray foam, testing their high-capacity gas boilers, and relying entirely on the fragile veins of the local power grid, Elias walked the gravel shoulders of the county highway. He swept through the ditches, checked the bins behind the local grocer, and methodically collected empty glass bottles. He was incredibly particular about his harvest. Clear glass was left untouched in the frost-hardened mud. His pale eyes scanned only for the dark, dense shades of abandoned refuse, deep forest green wine bottles, heavy amber beer jugs, and the opaque brown glass of old medicinal containers. He would place them into a heavy canvas sack, carrying them back to his isolated, weathered cabin on the edge of the tree line with the care of a man handling fragile, life-saving medicine. The residents of Oak Haven watched this daily pilgrimage with a mixture of pity and mounting irritation. Everyone understood that grief could unravel a mind. Even so, turning a front yard into a hoarding ground for unwashed glass just weeks before the first major blizzards were projected to swallow the valley felt less like an eccentric coping mechanism and more like an eyesore that threatened property values. Victor Vance, the head of the local homeowners committee, stood beside his running SUV one afternoon and spoke as if he were discussing a nuisance wildlife problem instead of a neighbor. "He's building a landfill," Victor remarked to his wife, his breath pluming in the crisp November air as he pointed toward Elias's property. "We get frosts down to -30 here. If he thinks a pile of trash is going to keep out the winter, they're going to find him frozen solid by January." Nobody argued with Victor's assessment. Nobody stepped forward to ask the old man what he was actually doing. They absorbed the verdict in silence, trusting implicitly in the automated, heavily engineered systems that heated their own homes. Elias absorbed their mocking stares in silence. Having lived on the edge of the woods long enough, he knew that the modern settlement was rotting from the inside out. They were entirely dependent on a distant power station. Months earlier, he had quietly mentioned at the hardware store that the new electrical substations were built in a drainage basin, and the wooden utility poles in the mountain pass were heavily compromised by dry rot. His concerns were dismissed as the rambling anxiety of a technological dinosaur. The warning disappeared. The structural rot did not. Instead of arguing, Elias spent the remaining daylight building. On the southern face of his cabin, where a drafty, rotting wooden veranda had stood for years, Elias began to construct a new wall. It was not built from modern lightweight framing. It was built from mass. He hauled heavy buckets of thick red clay from the riverbank, mixing it meticulously with sharp sand and chopped dry straw to prevent cracking. Then came the bottles. Every single piece of dark glass he had scavenged was carefully washed, thoroughly dried inside to ensure not a single drop of moisture remained, and sealed airtight with wooden corks.
Elias laid the heavy clay mortar down in thick beds, pressing the glass bottles into the mud horizontally. The narrow necks pointed inward toward the living space of the veranda, while the dark, flat bases faced outward, exposed to the elements. The work was agonizingly slow. The heavy clay weighed on his aging shoulders, leaving his joints aching long after sunset. Yet each row of glass solved a problem that the coming winter would gladly exploit. To the town, it looked like a wall of garbage. To Elias, it was a finely tuned machine. He was building a passive solar thermal mass. The dead, dry air trapped inside the sealed glass bottles was a perfect natural insulator, preventing the lethal outdoor cold from bleeding through the wall. More importantly, the dark pigment of the glass bases facing the street was designed to act as a solar collector. They would eagerly absorb the low-angle ultraviolet and infrared radiation of the winter sun, funneling that heat deep into the thick, dense clay. The mud would charge like a massive thermal battery during the day, and as the deadly nighttime temperatures plummeted, the clay would slowly radiate that captured heat back into the enclosed veranda. The wall was uneven, the mud was rough, but as Elias smoothed the final layer of clay around the dark glass eyes of his structure, he knew the physics were sound. Ground warmth could hold heat, just as the weathered geological surveys of the old frontier had proven. The system was in place. He did not need to fight the winter. He merely needed to catch what little warmth it was willing to surrender.
The storm caught Oak Haven just after Thanksgiving. It did not begin with a gentle snowfall. It arrived in full force. A screaming, relentless mountain wind that shifted constantly across the ridges. The sky bruised a deep, ominous purple, and the temperature began a terrifying vertical drop. Snow swept over the freshly paved roads and erased the property lines almost as fast as it fell. Inside the affluent homes, the residents retreated into their brightly lit living rooms. Smart thermostats clicked, signaling massive gas furnaces to roar to life. The electricity hummed through the walls, fighting back the plunging temperatures with sheer brute force. They watched the blizzard through double-paned windows, feeling entirely secure in their heated synthetic bubbles. On the third night of the storm, the deep freeze arrived. The thermometer outside Victor Vance's house dropped to minus 32 degrees Celsius. The wind struck the cliffs hard enough to send massive pine trees groaning in the dark. And then, somewhere deep in the mountain pass, a massive ice-laden timber snapped. It crashed through the main high-voltage transmission lines. In a fraction of a second, the entire valley of Oak Haven went black. The silence that followed was suffocating. Without electricity, the sophisticated gas boilers could not ignite. The blower fans died. The digital thermostats went blank. The invisible, fragile veins that kept the settlement alive had been severed in the dark. For the first 48 hours, the residents relied on heavy blankets and battery-powered lanterns, assuming the utility crews would restore the grid by morning. But the blizzard continued to hammer the ravines. The roads back to civilization were vanishing one layer at a time. By the dawn of the fourth day, Oak Haven was dying. Inside Victor's house, the ambient temperature plummeted below freezing. The expensive lightweight drywall and synthetic foam insulation could not generate heat, they could only slow its escape. Ice began to form on the inside of the windows. The copper plumbing filled with standing water began to freeze and expand, letting out sharp, terrifying cracks that echoed through the dying house. Breath plumed in the living room. Victor's children huddled beneath a mountain of coats, their lips taking on a dangerous pale blue tint. Desperation replaced arrogance. People began burning decorative furniture in open, aesthetic fireplaces that were never designed for heating.
losing 90% of the warmth straight up the metal flues. The cold was a relentless, methodical predator, pulling the life out of the subdivision room by room. But on the edge of the tree line, Elias Thorne's cabin told a very different story. The sun finally broke through the heavy cloud cover on the afternoon of the 5th day, weak and pale, casting long shadows across the snow. The outside air remained a lethal -30 degrees Celsius. As the low winter sun struck the heavy southern facade of Elias's veranda, the wall woke up. The hundreds of dark glass bottle bottoms set deep in the mortar began drinking the light. The glass funneled the solar radiation directly into the massive, dense clay surrounding it.
Inside the enclosed veranda, Elias sat in a rocking chair, wearing only a thick flannel shirt. He did not shiver. The air around him smelled of dry earth and old wood. He reached out and pressed his bare palm against the glass neck of a brown bottle protruding from the interior wall. It was not cold. It was radiating a steady, deep heat like a stone pulled from the edge of a dying campfire. The old man had not performed a miracle. He had simply built a system that refused to rely on wires. During the agonizingly cold day, the dark glass captured the sun. And as the sun set and the brutal night returned to crush the valley, the heavy clay wall began its long, slow exhale, radiating its stored heat exclusively into the enclosed room. While Oakhaven froze in the dark, Elias Thorne's garbage wall held the interior of his veranda at a steady, life-saving 15 degrees Celsius above zero. The old man poured himself a cup of water from a small cast-iron kettle. He looked out the window toward the dark, freezing subdivision down the hill. He knew that pride was a terrible insulator. It was only a matter of time before the cold stripped it away completely. The storm had delivered its verdict. Now he simply had to wait for the survivors to arrive. By the dawn of the 6th day, the affluent subdivision of Oakhaven was a graveyard of modern engineering. The cold did not simply exist in the air, it actively dismantled the infrastructure. Without ambient heat, the water trapped inside the vast networks of copper plumbing began to freeze solid. Ice expands with terrifying, unstoppable force. Throughout the neighborhood, the sharp, metallic cracks of bursting pipes echoed behind pristine drywall, sounding like distant gunfire in the dead, silent valley. Victor Vance had stopped checking his dead smartphone. The digital thermometers in his house had gone permanently blank, but the analog dial in his garage read a steady, lethal -28 degrees Celsius. His breath hung in the air of his own vaulted living room like thick gray smoke. He had burned through his small decorative pile of birch logs in the first 24 hours. He looked at his wife, who was holding their youngest daughter beneath a pile of heavy winter coats. The child was alarmingly lethargic. The human body can only shiver for so long before the muscles completely exhaust their glycogen stores and the core temperature begins its fatal, irreversible descent. Desperation strips away pride with remarkable efficiency. Victor wrapped himself in his heaviest parka, layered 2 pairs of gloves, and stepped out into the blinding white glare of the morning. The wind had died, leaving the valley suspended in a crystalline, deadly stillness. He began to walk, post-holing through knee-deep drifts, searching for any chimney that was smoking, any sign that someone, somewhere, had figured out how to cheat the frost. He wandered toward the edge of the tree line, instinctively moving away from the frozen grid of the subdivision. That was when he saw it. Elias Thorne's cabin sat exactly where it always had, but something was profoundly different. While the roofs of the modern houses were burdened with thick, overhanging slabs of ice, the snow on Elias's roof was melting near the edges.
Victor pushed through the drifts, his legs burning from the effort, until he rounded the corner and faced the southern wall, the garbage wall. He stopped. The air immediately surrounding the wall felt completely different. The snow directly at the base of the thick clay structure had retreated, leaving a narrow, dark strip of bare, damp earth. The hundreds of dark glass bottle bottoms set deep into the mortar were drinking the pale morning sunlight. Victor reached out with a trembling, heavily gloved hand. He hesitated, then pulled the glove off with his teeth and pressed his bare palm against the frozen exterior of the clay. It wasn't freezing. It was neutral, almost warm. In a world of minus 30 degrees Celsius, a neutral surface was a mathematical impossibility unless a massive amount of thermal energy was trapped inside. He didn't knock. His fingers were too numb to form a fist. He simply leaned his heavy weight against the thick wooden door of the veranda, and it gave way. The transition was violent in its comfort. Victor stumbled into the dimly lit space and fell to his knees on the wooden floorboards. The air wrapping around him was heavily, beautifully warm. It was not the sharp, dry, static heat of an electric radiator, but a heavy, radiant warmth that felt like lying on a sun-baked stone in the middle of July. Elias was sitting at a small wooden table, mending a tear in an old canvas coat with a heavy needle. He did not look surprised to see another person. He did not gloat. He simply looked up, set his needle down, and watched the younger man gasp for breath.
"My family," Victor choked out, the sudden warmth making his face sting fiercely as blood rushed back to his frozen capillaries. "My girls. They're freezing, Elias. The house is a tomb. We have absolutely nothing." Months earlier, Victor had stood on his driveway and called the old man's wall a landfill. He had confidently predicted the glass would shatter. Now he was kneeling on the old man's floor, begging for a fraction of the warmth those discarded bottles had captured. Elias Torn did not demand an apology. He understood that the cold was a strict enough teacher, and nature had already delivered the lecture. "Bring them," Elias said quietly, his voice raspy from disuse. "But tell them to step carefully. The glass is working. Don't block the light." Victor scrambled backward, rushing out the door to retrieve his family. By nightfall, the veranda was no longer empty. Victor returned with his wife and their 2 children, but they were not alone. Sarah, a neighbor who had previously complained about the aesthetics of Elias's yard, had seen Victor's frantic migration. She followed, dragging a plastic sled loaded with blankets and her elderly mother. Soon, David, the local mechanic, arrived carrying his infant son. The small space became crowded, but the thermal system held. The heavy clay wall, fully charged by the day's sun, began its nocturnal cycle. The dark bottles, insulated by the dense earth, prevented the bitter night air from penetrating. Elias kept a small, conservative fire burning in a cast-iron stove, boiling snow for drinking water. But as the days wore on and the population inside the veranda swelled to 14 desperate people, a new, insidious problem began to emerge. The system Elias had built was designed to capture heat and insulate against the cold. It was doing exactly that. However, 14 human bodies generate more than just ambient warmth. They generate a massive amount of water vapor. Every exhalation, every drop of sweat, every cup of snow boiled on the small stove added heavy moisture to the sealed environment. Elias noticed the real culprit before anyone else did.
The inner faces of the dark glass bottles, the very mechanisms keeping them alive, were beginning to cloud over. Thick droplets of condensation formed on the glass, merging and dripping down the heavy clay mortar. The air in the room was growing stifling, taking on the dense, suffocating quality of a damp cave. Moisture appeared where warmth met cold surfaces, and certain sections of the wall seemed wet long after the others had dried. David wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "It's getting incredibly hard to breathe in here, Elias. It feels heavy." Sarah touched the wall behind her. Her fingers came away slick with water. "The wall is sweating. Is the ice outside melting through?" Panic laced her voice. Elias stood up slowly. "The ice isn't melting through," he said calmly. "You are. 14 people breathe out gallons of water a day. If that moisture stays in here, it will soak into your clothes. Once your clothes are damp, the heat won't matter. The dampness will pull the warmth right out of your bones." He walked to the eastern edge of the veranda, reaching up to a small, square wooden hatch built near the ceiling. It was tightly sealed with rags. Without waiting for permission, Elias pulled the rags free and pushed the hatch open. A stream of razor-sharp, freezing air immediately curled into the room, visible as a swirling white mist as it hit the humid interior. Several people gasped. But Elias did not open it fully, just a narrow, calculated crack. Then he opened a second, identical vent near the floorboards on the western wall. A slow, deliberate draft was established. The heavy, moisture-laden air near the ceiling was drawn out through the upper vent, pulled by the intense pressure differential, while fresh, dry winter air slipped in through the bottom. The cave still wanted to breathe, and the new passages allowed air to move freely again. Within 20 minutes, the condensation on the dark glass bottles evaporated. The temperature in the room dropped slightly, settling at a crisp but survivable 14 degrees Celsius, but the deadly dampness was gone. "A wall is just a barrier," Elias explained to Victor, who was staring at the cleared glass. "A shelter is a system. Warm ground can support life, but warmth alone is not the system. Water, airflow, and stone are making decisions too." The people of Oakhaven sat in silence. They had spent thousands on automated climate control, yet they had been brought to their knees by a severed wire. Meanwhile, an old man had built a self-regulating microclimate out of mud and trash. But thermodynamics only solved half the equation of survival. The body now turned its attention to a different ache. Calories were running out. When the townspeople fled their freezing homes, they had grabbed bags of chips and boxes of cereal. By the end of the first week, those supplies were gone. Victor had tried to return to his smart fridge, only to find a graveyard of shattered glass jars and frozen, blackened produce. The ambient minus 25 degrees Celsius had ruined everything. "Everything is frozen solid," Victor reported grimly. Even the canned goods burst when the water inside expanded. Elias did not panic. He walked to the corner of the veranda and pulled back a heavy wool rug, revealing a square wooden trap door set flush into the floorboards. "When I built the wall, I didn't just build it to warm the air," Elias said, lifting the heavy door. "It shares its heat with the dirt below." Beneath the hatch was a meticulously organized root cellar. The heavy thermal mass of the clay wall extended down into the earth, keeping the subterranean space isolated from the fatal frost above. Inside, wooden bins lay the heavy wealth of the autumn harvest: rough-skinned potatoes, deep purple beets, thick winter squash, and bundles of carrots packed in dry sand. Elias handed a heavy canvas sack of flour to Sarah. It was perfectly dry. But raw flour required preparation. Elias moved to the center of the interior wall, where the clay swelled outward in a large dome. He pulled an iron plate away, revealing a deep, hollow chamber coated in black ash. It was a thermal oven, built directly into the mass of the wall, designed from clay, sandstone, and repeated corrections. "Fetch the embers from the wood stove," Elias directed. They fed the earthen oven, pushing glowing coals deep into the clay chamber. The heavy walls eagerly absorbed the intense heat. When Elias pulled the fire out, the clay itself was radiating a baking heat. Sarah mixed the flour with water, and Elias slapped the flat dough directly onto the scorching hot clay floor. Within minutes, the smell of baking bread, rich, toasted, and profoundly comforting, blanketed the veranda. Warm steam escaped through the split crusts and drifted across the chamber.
The scent reached the children, who sat up beneath their blankets, following the smell without saying a word. It was the scent of civilization, pulled from mud and fire. The system was expanding, but as the second week of the blackout arrived with crushing monotony, a heavy cellular fatigue began to drape over the occupants. The diet of root vegetables and flatbread provided calories, but it lacked vital, living nutrients. Elias recognized the signs of deficiency. One morning, he descended into the cellar and returned with a small weathered leather pouch of cold hardy seeds, winter rye, turnip, beet, and kale. He had once dreamed of cultivating his own plot with his late wife, a dream he now intended to resurrect in the dead of winter.
"We need soil," Elias announced, instructing the men to haul loamy earth up from the unfrozen depths of the cellar. They mixed it carefully with white ash and sand, constructing shallow planter boxes. Elias positioned the boxes with absolute precision beneath a single row of clear glass bottles he had incorporated at the very top of the southern wall. These clear bottles acted as primitive fiber optics, channeling a concentrated beam of pure sunlight directly into the dirt for several hours each day. They sowed the winter rye in dense rows, followed by the beets and the turnips. For people who had spent their lives buying shrink-wrapped produce, planting seeds in a -30°C blizzard felt like an act of desperate magic. These seeds don't need a summer. They just need to believe the winter won't kill them. The clay gives them warmth. The clear glass gives them light. On the 15th day, the system answered back. Tiny, fragile blades of neon green winter rye pushed their way through the dark soil, stretching desperately towards the light. The tightly curled leaves of the kale followed soon after. When Victor saw the first sprouts, a sudden tightness gripped his throat. In a world completely erased by white snow and black ice, that tiny splash of vibrant green was undeniable proof that they were not just surviving the winter, they were conquering it. The earthen engine was fully alive. The bottles caught the sun, the clay held the heat, the vents traded the air, the oven baked the bread, and the soil grew the green. But the true test of their newly forged community was still waiting in the dark, frozen ruins of the town below. The days bled seamlessly into the third week. The psychological victory of the green shoots sprouting in the wooden boxes sustained their spirits. But human biology is a ruthless accountant. Bread and winter greens provided hope, but enduring the bitter cold required more than just carbohydrates. The human body, constantly fighting to maintain its core temperature even inside the insulated veranda, demanded protein and fat. Elias knew that the stoneware crocks of salted pork he had salvaged from the cellar were meant to be stretched over an entire winter by one man, not devoured by 14 desperate people in a matter of weeks. The rations were shrinking. He needed fresh game. One afternoon, while the children slept and the adults sat in a lethargic silence, Elias went to a rusted metal toolbox in the corner of the room. He bypassed the heavy steel tools and pulled out a tangled coil of repurposed scrap wire. Sitting by the ambient heat of the wood stove, he began to methodically cut and twist the metal into simple looping snares. Victor watched the old man's precise movements. "You're going hunting? With wire?" "Elias, I have a hunting rifle locked in my safe at home. If we can get back there—" "Guns are loud, Victor," Elias interrupted, tightening a small slip knot in the metal. "A gunshot echoes for miles in this cold. It scares away more game than it kills, and every missed shot is a wasted bullet. Wire doesn't make a sound. Wire doesn't miss. It simply waits." Elias handed 3 of the finished snares to Victor and motioned toward the door. The transition from the 14-degree warmth of the veranda to the -28-degree exterior was a physical shock. The air outside was so dry and cold that it felt like inhaling needles. Elias did not lead Victor into the deep woods. Instead, they moved along the edge of the property where the wild sagebrush and scrub oak met the deep sculpted snowdrifts.
Elias dropped to his knees, ignoring the biting cold, and pointed to the ground. "Look at the brush," Elias instructed. "Don't look for the animal. Look for the geometry of the snow."
Slowly, Victor saw it. Winding beneath the tangled branches of the scrub oak were faint, narrow snowpack trails. They were the highways of snowshoe hares, packed down by repetitive use beneath the protective cover of the brush. Guided by his years of reading the silent landscape, Elias set the traps precisely along these hidden corridors, anchoring the wire to sturdy roots. Every few days, the traps yielded a catch. The butchering process was a grim, silent affair, but the results transformed the atmosphere inside the cabin. Every part of the animal was utilized. In a world of absolute scarcity, waste was a fatal sin. The dark, rich meat provided life-saving nourishment and fat. The crushed bones were boiled down for hours into a heavy, nutrient-dense broth, which Sarah used to soak their dry, unleavened flatbread. Even the pelts were carefully scraped, stretched, and dried near the earthen oven to add a crucial layer of warmth to their communal sleeping platform. The system was expanding. But, as the third week closed, the garbage wall faced its greatest challenge. A mountain wind descended through the valley from a direction Elias had never seen before. It twisted through the upper trees and dropped directly toward the southern face of the cabin. Inside the veranda, the change was almost immediate. The smoke from the wood stove, which normally drifted smoothly up the flue, stalled. Then it began creeping back toward the sleeping platform. By sunset, the familiar smell of wood smoke had turned sharp and acrid. By midnight, the air in the chamber was visibly hazy. The occupants coughed in the dark. The children tossed restlessly. Every time they closed their eyes, another ribbon of smoke found its way into their lungs. Near dawn, as the haze grew nearly unbearable, Elias walked to the exterior exhaust vent. He looked through the narrow crack and finally discovered the real issue. 2 days prior, Victor had ventured outside to clear the drifting snow. Fearing that the wind was stripping too much heat from the base of the wall, he had neatly stacked a barrier of freshly split firewood directly beneath the exhaust vent to block the draft. The rebuilt windbreak had become too effective. By blocking one specific airflow path on the exterior, Victor had completely disrupted the natural draft moving through the veranda. The interior still wanted to breathe, but the new structure outside was forcing that air to take the wrong route, pushing the smoke back down the chimney. "Victor, David, put your boots on," Elias commanded, his voice tight from the smoke. They rushed outside into the howling wind. They frantically dismantled part of the firewood barrier, tossing the heavy logs aside and opening a narrow passage where the air could move freely again. The result was instantaneous. Back inside, they watched as the next plume of smoke rose from the stove, bent sharply toward the exhaust vent, and disappeared into the darkness. The room took a deep, clearing breath. Elias stood by the vent, his hands black with soot. He looked at Victor, who was staring at the floor in profound shame. The failure had not come from the storm. It had come from a design decision. Sometimes the flaw is hidden inside the solution itself. When you try to block the world out completely, you usually end up choking on yourself. Part 4. The Visitor and the Verdict. Day 46 of the Great Freeze began like any other morning inside the enclosed veranda. Fresh dough rested near the interior clay wall. A thin, concentrated beam of sunlight had just reached the wooden planter boxes when David suddenly lifted his head. He didn't speak. That was what caught Victor's attention. David simply stood, ears forward, staring toward the heavy wooden door. A moment later, the distinct, agonizing crunch of boots breaking through the icy crust of the snowpack echoed through the heavy timber walls. Someone was approaching. Inside the veranda, the occupants froze.
Victor instinctively reached for a heavy iron fire poker, his knuckles white. Elias Torn calmly set down his leatherwork. "Open the door," Elias said simply, "before they freeze to death on the porch."
Outside, a man named Jonah Pike, the county's winter mail carrier and saddle repairman, was standing in disbelief. For the past 3 weeks, he had been moving slowly between the isolated subdivisions of Oak Haven, surveying the catastrophic damage to the power grid. He had assumed the old man at the edge of the woods was dead. It was the smell that stopped him before he even reached the porch. Fresh bread. For several seconds, Jonah simply stood in the minus 25 degrees Celsius air, staring at the dark glass-studded mud wall, trying to comprehend the sheer impossibility of what he was smelling. The rich, yeasty scent of baking dough cut through the sterile winter air like a physical blow. The scent grew stronger as he moved forward, defying the icy graveyard that Oak Haven had become. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing Victor. Victor looked feral, his beard overgrown, his clothes stained with wood smoke, but he was undeniably, robustly alive. "Get inside," Victor rasped, grabbing Jonah by the heavy canvas of his parka and hauling him into the airlock of the porch, quickly sealing the door against the wind. When Jonah stepped from the porch into the main veranda, he slowly removed his frosted goggles. He stood completely paralyzed. The thermal earthen oven sat near the rear wall, radiating an intense baking heat. Dry, scavenged firewood was stacked neatly beside the small metal stove. But none of that shocked the mail carrier as much as the wooden boxes in the corner. Green leaves stretched upward beneath a shaft of sunlight. Kale, young winter rye, and vibrant beet greens were thriving. It was life, aggressively growing in the absolute dead center of a merciless winter. Jonah remained in the shelter for most of the afternoon. Eventually, as they fed him hot broth and fresh bread, the conversation turned back toward the rest of Oak Haven. The news was devastating. "The modern baking ovens in town have developed cracked chimneys," Jonah explained, holding the tin cup of broth with shaking hands. "Smoke leaks into the work area whenever the wind shifts. Children are eating less. Older residents struggle with hard rations that require more chewing than many can manage." As Jonah spoke, Elias listened without interrupting. He asked questions. How much flour remained? Who had children? Who had elderly family members? When he finished, a heavy, mournful silence settled across the veranda. Elias looked toward the planter boxes, then toward the fresh loaf resting beside the hearth. "The first deliveries will go to the families with the greatest need," Elias said. "Bread, greens, whatever the shelter can spare." What surprised Jonah was who appeared on the list Elias began to dictate. Several names belonged to the very people who had stood on their vinyl porches and laughed at the garbage wall. One belonged to the household that had supported the town's original decision to ignore the roof maintenance, the very neglect that had eventually ruined the community stores. None of that changed the equation for Elias. The food would go anyway. By sunset, Jonah was helping prepare sacks for the journey back to town. Deep within the glowing veranda, a new kind of system had taken root. It was no longer built only to keep 14 lives alive. Now, it was preparing to carry a little warmth beyond the ravine. The storm that finally broke Oak Haven was the same storm many residents had feared all winter. For 2 days and 2 nights, the wind hammered the settlement without mercy. Snow piled against buildings. Ice formed where rain should never have reached. Then, sometime before dawn, part of the main community center roof gave way. The damage spread quickly. Water found its way into storage. Flour absorbed moisture. Entire sections of the reserve became useless within days. The town suddenly faced a question it could no longer avoid. Where had the bread been coming from? The answer arrived during a crowded meeting inside the church hall. Jonah Pike stood before the same people who had spent weeks inventing theories. He told them the truth. The bread, the vegetables, the winter greens, all of it came from the edge of the woods, and all of it came from the hands of Elias Thorn. Silence followed.
Victor Vance, the homeowner who had once mocked the earth-built shelter, stared at him. The town leaders did not speak. Most had expected Elias Thorne to die before the first major blizzard ended. Instead, he had built a working shelter. He had grown food. He had baked bread. And while Oakhaven struggled to feed itself, that same man had been quietly helping feed them.
A week after Jonah revealed the truth, a small group left Oakhaven and climbed toward the tree line. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they had run out of explanations. The ravine looked smaller than most had imagined. So did the shelter. There were no hidden machines, no buried treasure, no miracle waiting inside the mud walls. What they found instead was work. Most successful systems appeared simple after they were finished. The difficult part was seeing the hundreds of decisions buried underneath them. Elias met the visitors near the veranda entrance. He did not seem surprised. The group slowly moved through the shelter. Their eyes landed on details that would have meant nothing a few months ago. The drainage trench running beside the growing beds, the willow lattice separating crops from damp limestone, the thermal oven built from clay, sandstone, and repeated corrections. The garden chamber drew the most attention. Rows of kale occupied one section, beets filled another. Young turnips grew where the first failed crop had once died. Victor spent several minutes studying the oven before finally speaking. "The draft stays steady?" Elias nodded. Then he showed him where the airflow entered, where it exited, and how one poorly placed barrier had nearly ruined the entire system. He listened carefully. For once, he was not offering advice. He was asking for it. The speeches that sounded convincing back in Oakhaven felt strangely small inside a shelter built by observation, labor, and persistence. Outside, winter still controlled the mountains. Snow covered the ridges. Nothing about the season had become easier. Yet the evidence stood in front of everyone. The bread existed. The vegetables existed. The shelter existed. Warm stone held heat. Proper drainage protected roots. Good airflow prevented smoke from returning. Bread baked when ovens stored enough energy. Mistakes produced consequences. Correct solutions produced results. Belief never entered the equation. Near sunset, the visitors began the walk back to Oakhaven. No formal apologies were exchanged. None were necessary. Victor carried new ideas home. Others carried questions they should have asked months earlier. Back inside the veranda, the oven released a final wave of warmth as another loaf finished baking. Steam drifted upward through a crack in the crust. Beyond the walls, winter remained exactly what it had always been. But inside the glass and mud, the system was complete. Proof that survival was not a matter of luck, but of understanding the world enough to build a place within it.